Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I see we have a wonderful audience today. It's great to see so much interest from our community, and thank you for supporting us in that way. As I said last week, we are very sad we could not have a conference in 2021, but these webinars provide a way for us to remain in touch with one another and to share our research. And today I would like to welcome especially Professor Timm Hoffman from the University of Cape Town. And he is our silver medalist, our SAAB silver medalist for 2020. So a huge congratulations to him and a very warm welcome. He has prepared a very interesting talk for us today. But before we launch into that, I'd like to ask the outgoing president, Professor Stephen Boatwright, to just congratulate him formally. So Stephen would normally have done this at the conference dinner, the dinner where we celebrate such special occasions. And because we didn't have the conference, Tim has been given his medal, which he'll show off to you later. Oh, there he's got it right next to him.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Glynis. Welcome on behalf of myself also to everyone. The medals are a great part of SAAB where we can celebrate both our young people, as we did last week, but also the established leaders in our community. So the SAAB gold and silver medals celebrate really the people at the height of their careers that have made a significant lifetime contribution to SAAB. SAAB and botany as a whole. This is both in terms of training of students, producing research, and academic leadership as a whole. So I want to thank the nominators for nominating people, and I'd like this opportunity then to thank Muthama Mwasia and then congratulate Professor Timm Hoffman on this excellent and well-deserved achievement. We look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks. So then I'm going to invite, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to invite Muthama Mwasia, who nominated Tim for the award, just to say a few words as well. Over to you, Muthama.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Glynis. Good afternoon, colleagues. And again, congratulations to Tim on this beautiful and wonderful award. It's humbling to be with Tim. And just to say a few words, which I'm sure I'm going to make him feel very embarrassed because he's a man who does not like to be on the limelight. But Tim is a researcher, Tim is a teacher, and Tim is an active member of the Botanical and Biodiversity Society in South Africa, in the world, and especially in the last 3 decades. At the moment, Tim is the Leslie Hill Chair of Plant Conservation at UCT, and also the Director of the Plant Conservation Unit. And if you look at what he does, you know, he has had 10 years at SAAB as a researcher and 20 years at UCT. And over those years, he's been working at the interface of biodiversity, landscapes, and people. And he's one of the few people who has had long-term interest, especially in the drawing a piece of paper to sign on an expense that Tim had incurred counting donkeys. What botanist counts donkeys? But if you're interested in what impacts landscapes and how those are likely to impact on biodiversity, indeed, you are likely to do that. And over time, Tim has, as a teacher, produced guided to success over 14 PhD students, over 45 MSc students, and over 50 honors students, not to mention the number of undergraduates who enjoy sitting and learning from him. Tim, as a researcher, has a CV which is, I wish when I grow up to be like him, you know, over 140 scientific papers, which have been cited over 7,300 times, an H-index, for those who care about it, of 48, and a B-rated scientist for a number of years. So Tim is a giant among us. But importantly in society, as a member of the Leslie Hill Succulent Karoo Trust, he's been part of the custodians working with other stakeholders to secure landscapes for conservation. And in all these, team has been working with citizen science in the photo essay and all other ways to make sure that we understand the changes that are happening. Coincidentally and happily, when the SAAB award was announced to him in the same week, WWF also awarded him the 2020 Living Planets Award. Just to tell us that, you know, if we had not done it, someone else would have recognized him before us. Colleagues, let's welcome a giant of botany, an humble person, a caring member of our community to talk to us. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Muthama. Very fitting tribute there. So we're going to move now to the presentation. Tim has elected to do a voice-over PowerPoint. I'm hoping that you'll have sufficient sound. We have got it as high as possible here. We do have a backup plan if there's any problems. So let's hope that it will go smoothly. Just before we do that, just to mention what I'd put in the chat here, that if anyone requires SACNAP points for attending this webinar, please could you put your name in the chat and indicate that. And then if you have any questions, if you could just hold them until the end and not put them in the chat, because that could be a little distracting. And then I will use the chat to see who wants to ask questions, or you could raise your hand. Or you could put your question into the chat and I could read it for you, whichever you wish. So without much ado, let's move on to sharing the PowerPoint, and we look forward to this. Thank you so much, Tim. Okay. So it's trying to happen. Okay. Okay, possibly not. Sure, can you give it a try and see if you can share? I'll stop trying to share and you see if it'll work from your side.
Okay, coming up.
Okay. Let's just stop the video. Okay.
Yeah, so the sound is not coming through, Glynis.
Okay. Can you unmute yourself, Shirk?
It's based on an article that I wrote.
Yes, can you hear it now?
Groot and for the journal in 2019.
It's because
with a rather
Can you go back to the beginning?
title.
Okay, I'll go back to slide 1. Just let me know if it's working.
I'm just going to go out and come back in again, but carry on, Shirk.
Okay.
I thought I'm most grateful to Professor Mathama Mwasia for nominating me for this award in the first place, and then to the SAAB committee for considering my nomination.
Yeah, but it's out of sync now. You need to go back to the beginning and start again.
Actual shiny silver medal.
Okay, I'll just stop sharing. Sorry about that. I'll just stop sharing and I'll try again. Okay. Thanks for that feedback, Tim. And we'll just do it again. Share screen. There we go. And it should share it now. And I'll start the PowerPoint. And let's see what happens.
I'm most grateful to Professor Mathama Mwasia for nominating me for this award in the first place, and then to the SAAB committee for considering my nomination worthy of support. The award comes with an actual shiny silver medal, and I feel honored to be part of this list of South African botanists, many of whom were my lecturers, mentors, colleagues, and friends at one time or another. I'm also most grateful to the many students and colleagues with whom I've worked over more than 35 years, as well as to the institutions who have supported me. I thought I would use this occasion to share with you the main focus of my research over the last 3.5 decades. Pretty much throughout this time, I've been interested in how and why the vegetation of Southern Africa has changed over time. As my understanding has grown, I've also become interested in how these historical changes tie in with what my colleagues are saying is likely to happen in the future. This talk is based on an article that I wrote with my friends Groot and Lindsay Gilson for the journal Anthropocene in 2019, with a rather provocative title, Rethinking Catastrophe, Historical Trajectories and Modeled Future Vegetation Change in Southern Africa. For those interested, there was a critical response to our article in 2020 by 2 colleagues from WITS, and the journal also then gave us the opportunity to respond to their critique, which we did. What I'd like to cover in this webinar follows quite closely the content of the 2019 paper. I'll introduce the idea that a continuum exists between the past, the present, and the future, and then provide a brief summary of what has been written about Southern Africa's environmental future. We've relied quite heavily on repeat photography in our work, and so I need to explain how we do this in a bit more detail. Then the bulk of the webinar will be spent on a discussion of some of the major biomes in Southern Africa and how we think they have changed over the last century. Not all of the historical trajectories tie in with the future projections, and I'd like to suggest a few ideas as to why this might be the case. Finally, the webinar will conclude with a general discussion. Climate change models have had a significant influence on a wide range of national and global policies that affect the way society uses energy, consumes natural resources, and prepares for a more sustainable future. However, future projections on their own provide insufficient justification for large-scale interventions in the way society functions and uses resources. They require a great deal of trust in the scientific community who produce them. It's our view that greater reconciliation and integration of findings from paleoecological studies, historical observations, satellite-based remote sensing products and models will help to build a stronger, evidence-based policy framework. The rationale for this past, present, future continuum, therefore, is that knowledge of the past helps us to establish baseline conditions, while an assessment of the present helps to get an idea of the nature, extent and rate of change. Knowing this in turn will help to assess future trajectories of change and to develop suitable responses. So what has been said about the future of Southern African climates? While some of the details have changed over time, most climate change scenarios suggest that Southern Africa will become hotter and drier over the next 100 years. Some projections are that temperatures will be as much as 7 degrees Celsius warmer in the central Kalahari region by 2100, while the winter rainfall region will be heavily impacted by a weakening and southward retreat of the main rain-bearing systems as a result of global warming. The recent mega drought over the Western Cape has been described as the harbinger of things to come. And what is the evidence to date? There have been surprisingly few published syntheses of historical trends in key climate variables such as temperature and rainfall for the country. The 2014 paper by Neil McKellar and colleagues is one of the more recent contributions and shows that the projections for temperature are largely on track, except for the central interior, where minimum temperatures decreased over the period 1960 to 2010. Trends in rainfall are spatially variable and are not well reflected in the downscaled climate model simulations. While we await an updated national synthesis, several local and regional analyses are available and make for interesting reading. For example, in 2011, we analyzed climate data from 20 ARC weather stations in the Western Cape for the period 1965 to 2005. To our amazement, we found that while temperature had increased in the region and rainfall had no trend, evaporation as measured from an APAN had decreased significantly over the period of measurement. Wind run too had declined significantly at most of the weather stations, and the relationship between the two is obvious. This so-called evaporation paradox is a global phenomenon and deserves more focus than it is currently received in South Africa, especially since it has such a significant influence on soil moisture and plant growth. If climate change projections for Southern Africa suggest a hotter and drier future, what are the implications of this for vegetation, for biodiversity, and for ecosystem function? We looked at about 10 of the main papers and reports which model how Southern African environments might change in the future in response to climate change. The details are in a paper, but for the western part of the region, the projections are that the increase in temperature will lead to a general aridification of the environment, resulting in the contraction of more mesic biomes and expansion of arid shrublands and deserts, and even possibly the remobilization of the Kalahari dune fields. About a third of all species in these areas will be negatively affected. For the eastern summer rainfall areas, the major change will be an increase in woody plant cover and the contraction of the grassland biome as a result of carbon dioxide enrichment and increased temperature, with negative impacts on biodiversity as well. Other effects mentioned include an increase in fire frequency, negative impacts on the hydrology of rivers and wetlands, and several significant negative social impacts as well, including on agricultural production. These projections have had an important influence on policy, on research, and on our actions. The models on which the projections are based have been developed by many individuals who are national and international leaders in their field and reflect some of the best science in the discipline. We don't question these projections, but take them at face value. Instead, our focus is to ask whether the projections envisaged for the future are already evident in the historical trends of environmental change. If they're not yet evident, then it makes sense to ask why that might be the case. So, how are we doing? Firstly, how do we know how environments have changed? There are many ways to study the past, including through the disciplines shown here, such as paleoecology and archaeology, each one of which has its own specialist demands. Our focus in the paper and in what follows has been on repeat ground photography, on archival sources, and occasionally on botanical surveys. Our emphasis is on the landscape and on the historical processes that have shaped the environment that we see today. We are fortunate in Southern Africa in having such a rich photographic history. Botanists such as I.V. Paul Evans, Rudolf Marloth, Margaret Levins, and John Acox took many photographs of Southern African landscapes during their careers, and they are a rich source of information for anyone interested in traveling back in time. To date, our collection of historical landscape photographs at the Plant Conservation Unit comprises about 30,000 images from more than 80 photographers. Having a printout of an historical photograph is one thing. You need to find the location in order to retake the image. We usually start with maps, and these days with a Google Earth tour, but it often comes down to opening farm gates, knocking on doors, and speaking to landowners. This gives you the chance to not only meet some pretty interesting and creative people, but also to find out about the land use history of the site as well. Usually, however, it's just you and the photograph, and you can spend hours and even days driving around trying to find a site. But when you find it and are able to step into the time machine and look at changes over 130 years, such as in this Nama desert scene, it makes it all worthwhile. Once you find the general location, the work really starts. First, you need to find the exact location, then set up the tripod and start with the documentation process. This involves not only the obvious things like recording the GPS coordinates and drawing a sketch map to help future visitors, documenting the cameras and settings for the range of photographs that you need to take, including a panorama of the location, but most importantly, also the changes that are evident in the landscape. The way in which we document the changes is to firstly divide the landscape into different landform units, such as rivers and plains, terraces, and then to physically walk into the image, sampling each of these landforms in turn. Ideally, a permanent record of the transect can be created by using the breadcrumbs trail option in GPS. We usually take additional photographs of each of the landforms, such as this one of the Sandy River course, as well as of the dominant or important species in the landscape. And we make notes of what we see that could help us in interpreting the changes over time. We also usually provide a checklist of the main species in each of the landforms and an estimate of the % cover of each species in the unit. Notes are also made of population sizes, mortality within different size classes, erosional features, grazing impacts, and so on. After sampling, we get together at the camera station and talk about the changes and draft in the field a short narrative of change for each of the different landforms, such as the Sandy River course, the Granite Mountain in the foreground of this image, and so on. At a site like this in Namibia, we could spend most of the day photographing, sampling, documenting, and discussing the changes in the landscape. Our approach in the field is mostly qualitative, but once we get back to the lab and have matched the historical and repeat photographs, we try and provide a more quantitative assessment of the changes evident over time. We've tried a range of different approaches, including point frequency estimates using a grid, such as you see in the two images on the left, in which we score the proportion of, say, bare ground, shrub, and grass cover. We've also tried to automate the process using supervised and unsupervised classification techniques in GIS, but these have also run into a few problems, especially since the original images are usually in black and white and don't have the diversity in tone to be able to differentiate between different species and growth forms. What we've settled on for the biome level summaries is an estimate of cover based on a 5-point vegetation cover change index. We usually get 3 or 4 ecologists together, look at a pair of images and decide through consensus whether the cover of different growth forms has increased or decreased according to the criteria shown here. For example, for this particular comparison, we could probably agree that there's been an increase in tree cover over time, probably between about 5 and 25%. We then score this pair as +1. After doing this for all the match photographs in a biome, we count the number of photos in each class and express this as a percentage of the total number of photographs for the different landforms in each biome. A quick look at the summary graph, for example, will show that this biome, most of the images show no change in cover, although the distribution is skewed to the right, especially within the rivers and ephemeral streams. A much smaller proportion of the photographs show a decline in vegetation over time. So this is more or less what we've been doing for the last few decades. And so far I've assembled a collection of about 2,000 images, which are reflected by the black dots you see on this map of Southern Africa. Sam Jack, myself, Rick Rody, and James Patrick have taken most of the repeats, together with many students who have used them in a variety of postgraduate studies and theses. About 5 years ago, we also launched RePhoto SA together with the support of Les Underhill and Rene Navarra under the recent direction of the Fitzpatrick Institute. And this is a citizen science project, and we've added about 280 additional photographs been added by citizen scientists across the country. Repeat photography has been used in about 60 studies of long-term vegetation change in Africa. The main strengths of this technique are firstly that the images cover a unique time period that sits between paleoecological studies on the one hand and botanical surveys on the other. The second strength is that the images allow you to see a level of detail that's often missing in remotely sensed images derived from satellites and even in aerial photography. In some cases, species and growth forms can be identified and even population sizes estimated. Photographs are also easily accessible and they're understood by everybody. One of the major limitations of the technique is that most repeat photos only include 2 time steps. This snapshot sampling can be a problem, as incorrect assumptions about what has happened in the intervening years can lead to the wrong conclusion about the trajectory of change. Also, differences in the time of year and even time of day when the 2 photographs are taken can lead to problems of interpretation. Each image is also unique, and sorting out appropriate analytical techniques to assess change has been quite a challenge. So what do the repeat photographs suggest about how each of the Southern Africa's biomes have changed over time? We're going to start with the desert biome. The results shown here are based on a study published by Rick and colleagues in the Journal of Arid Environments in 2019. The analysis is based on 75 repeat photos shown in the map on the left, which are taken in 4 vegetation units, distributed across gradients of precipitation and fog. In general, rainfall increases and the incidence of fog decreases as you move away from the coast. This results in a fog belt zone along the coast, a savanna transition zone further inland, and a grassland shrubland zone between the two. Several large ephemeral rivers such as the Khan, the Swartkops, and the Krieshead also run through the Nama Desert. The focus of this study was on the changes in woody plant cover over the last 100 years in order to assess hypotheses about aridification and the expansion of arid adapted species into more mesic environments as a result of climate change. The diagram in the top left of this slide shows the percent cover of woody plants in the original photograph and the percent cover in the repeat photograph for each of the 4 vegetation types. The red line is where y equals x, and if all before and after photos were aligned along the red line, then there would be no change in woody vegetation cover. The blue line shows the line of best fit to the data we collected at each photo site. The overall pattern is that there was very little change in woody cover in the vegetation units closest to the coast, but significant increases in the savanna transition zone, and especially in the large ephemeral rivers of the Nama. In some of the fog belt sites, there was clear recruitment of new individuals of the fog belt specialist Arthurua lubnitzii, such as is seen here in this image from near Rossing Mountain. The green dots in the bottom right photograph denote new recruits. Overall, however, the change in cover was not significant in the fog belt zone, perhaps also because of the very low cover values of woody plants to start with in this zone. And here's another site within the fog belt zone, which makes the point about there being very little noticeable change in the vegetation in this zone. The grass shrub zone in the image on the two images on the left was also stable, although several sites closer to the coast, just outside of the fog belt zone, showed a slight loss of cover. You can see the blue arrows show two trees that were still present nearly 100 years later. The pair of photographs on the right, however, show a very typical pattern of increasing woody plant cover in the savanna transition zone. Bush encroachment in the arid savannas of Namibia has been reported on for decades and was also reported on by Rick and I in our 2012 paper on long-term changes in the Nama-Karoo and savanna biomes of Namibia. The greatest increase in woody plant cover was in the large ephemeral rivers, such as you see here at Gobberberg, although this image shows a relatively modest increase since 1965. Cover values were generally high, with each river system presenting distinct traits in relation to vegetation change. Some rivers were more stable than others, and some were more impacted by people and invasive alien plants than others. What happens upstream has implications for what we see in the landscape downstream. A general summary for our Central Namib Desert study would read as follows. Firstly, woody cover has increased in all zones except in the grass shrubland zone, where there's considerable variability between sites. Landscapes in the region generally had less cover in the first half of the 20th century than they have today. Desert and arid shrubland vegetation types, representative of the hot desert zone, have not expanded into the region's grassy savannas, and there's little evidence for the general aridification hypothesis as yet. If anything, the opposite has occurred. Our results suggest a stable or perhaps slight increase in incidence of fog and a westward expansion of rainfall in the savanna transition zone. What happens to the Benguela has important implications for the fog belt zone. A tipping point might, of course, just be around the corner, but we see no evidence of this as yet. So let's move on to the succulent Karoo biome. The synthesis for this area, which we outlined in our Rethinking Catastrophe paper, draws on an examination of more than 250 photographs and a number of papers which we have published in the peer-reviewed literature, the most important of which are highlighted in blue. The key results of this work suggest that the most comparisons show little change in vegetation cover on the slopes and the plains habitats of the succulent Karoo biome. Remember, this is the biome which in the early projections was considered to be most vulnerable to climate change and subject to aridification because of the weakening of the cyclonic westerlies and failure of winter rains. However, our analysis suggests that there are more comparisons between photopairs which show an increase in cover than a decrease. Only about 10% of the photographs we've assessed show a decrease in cover. As was the case in the Namib Desert study, the ephemeral rivers of the succulent Karoo show the greatest increase in cover. Here's a rather typical scene in the succulent Karoo taken by Paul Evans in 1920 near the farm Tirhoek, just west of Calvinia. The cover is quite sparse and is dominated by kopokbos and a few low-grade succulents. 85 years later, there's little difference except perhaps for a slight increase in height and perhaps a small increase in the cover of dominant shrubs. Ephemeral rivers are critical habitats in dryland ecosystems because water flows through them occasionally and change usually occurs more rapidly than on plains. They're often also a good indicator of environmental health for the wider region as well. As our earlier graph suggests, it is in the ephemeral river systems where woody cover has increased the most, as you can see from the site near Ladysmith in the Cape. While shotias and eucleas are present in the river, the change in woody plant cover is largely as a result of the increase in Vitellia Karoo. Up until 2015, most long-term analyses of rainfall showed no significant change over the course of the 20th century in the succulent Karoo. Given the recent mega drought in the region, most recent analyses might show a different pattern. We argued, however, that the change in land use practices in the succulent Karoo might account for some of the differences we observed between our matched photographs. For example, the total number of livestock has declined by 2/3 since the 1950s, while the area sown to wheat is only a fraction of what it used to be as recently as the early 1970s, when the practice was heavily subsidized by the state and farmers were incentivized to clear lands for wheat. The abandonment of old lands is evident throughout the biome, such as this photograph of a recovering field just south of Springbok shows. The impact of these old lands on the ecology of the succulent Karoo is yet to be fully assessed, as it takes upwards of 100 years for an old ploughed field in the Namakaroo to support similar levels of diversity as adjacent unploughed land. There are a number of locations, however, which have challenged our generally positive narrative for the biome. The first is the site on Cornell's Kop, where our repeat photos show a collapse of mature trees over the last 50 years. We interpret these changes and those for other tree aloes not necessarily in terms of recent climate change impacts, but rather as part of a much longer process of climate change, which needs to consider climatic conditions during the 18th and 19th centuries when these tall trees would have recruited. Another location which has given us pause for thought is the site just west of Kubus in the southern Rottersveld, a formerly quite dense stand of Brownanthus pseudo-schlichtianus, devastated either by aridification or by grazing. We are not sure which. Norbert Jurgens, who knows the region better than anyone else, describes this as a classic desertification. Finally, the succulent Karoo has just come through the greatest drought in living memory, and some areas are still being impacted. Anecdotal evidence suggests that some populations of succulent species in the Rottersveld have been devastated by the drought, and early published accounts, such as this 2018 article by Gretel van Rooyen and colleagues, suggest that the drought has had a significant negative impact on both wildlife, but also on perennial plant cover, for example, at Guchab Nature Reserve. And perhaps the most convincing canary in the coal mine to date is provided by Nick Helm and Uta Schmidl's 2020 article in Faults and Flora. Their documentation of widespread mortality of several key species in the lowlands of Namakaroo provides a clearest warning yet, perhaps, of things to come. It seems that the plains environments are particularly badly affected, such as you can see in the top right-hand photograph. What about the FYNBOS biome? Well, most models suggest that this biome will be severely negatively impacted by climate change. Increased temperatures and reduced rainfall will lead to general aridification of the biome and a loss of species, including some of our more charismatic Proteaceae. Measuring these impacts in the FYNBOS biome is extremely difficult. This is not only because of fire, which sets everything back to zero on a fairly regular basis, but also because of the dynamic nature of the vegetation. Some species appear to be highly mobile in the landscape, as is shown in this pair of photographs on the right. In 1966, for example, Protea lepidocarpodendron was not visible in this Cape Point landscape, but by 2011, it was so dense that it was almost impossible to walk through the Protea thicket. One of the few studies of long-term change in FYNBOS was carried out by Zoe Poulsen, who showed how forest cover had increased on the Cape Peninsula, largely as a result of the exclusion of fire. Late 19th century photographs of the peninsula show open landscapes, few trees, or even shrubs, and many bulbs, exactly what you'd expect to find in FYNBOS, which was burnt on a regular basis. Decades of fire exclusion, however, has resulted in the increase in cover, especially of forest and forest pioneer species, such as in this view of Blinkwater Ravine above Camps Bay. Zoe also visited each one of the 174 forest patches on the Cape Peninsula and used aerial photos to map the change in forest cover between 1944 and 2008. Her mapping showed where the increase had been greatest and she argued that the changes reflected a recovery from frequent fires, the sort that had been described by Neville Pillins, Rudolf Marloff, and Margaret Levins in a series of articles in the 1924 volume of the South African Journal of Science. Two questions follow from Zoe's work. The first is concerned with the obvious impact of expanding tree cover on fynbos vegetation, and the second asks whether these trends are widespread in the greater Cape forestic region. In terms of the second question, Nina Zitsimia, one of our honor students, looked at long-term changes in forest cover in Swartbush-Kloof in Jonkershoek near Stellenbosch. She also found an overall increase in forest cover, but the story seemed a bit more complicated in that not all of the riverine forests behaved in the same way. Scree forests were generally stable over time, as one would expect, but some of the riverine forests decreased in cover over time. It seems that the kind of vegetation which is growing right next to you can have important implications for whether you persist, you expand, or you shrink over time. The particular fire history at a site is also critical. What about long-term changes in mountain fynbos locations where the expansion of forest cover is not an issue? How has the cover and composition of mountain fynbos changed generally over the last 100 years? This is an important question because unlike today, we know that people were living in the mountains in the late 19th century. As you can see from this image of the Fisses farm just above the shale band in the Cedarburg, people had permanent homesteads, they cultivated small areas, had many animals, and most importantly, as the quote from Marloff suggests, they burnt the mountains to ashes. What effect did this have on the vegetation, and how's it changed now that most fynbos mountains form part of one or other water catchment or conservation area? The best visual example of these mountain fires is this image created by Petra Holden of a 1949 aerial photograph of the Groot wilderness area. The adjacent map of the fire scars of this period shows both the patchiness and the extent of the fires. We're fortunate that before the Winterhoek was declared a wilderness area and protected as a water catchment area, the CSIR set up a series of permanent transects and photos that were resurveyed by Petra Holden and Sam Jack in 2015. Petra's analysis, which formed part of her PhD, showed that for the transect data, canopy cover in vegetation of a similar post-fire age increased overall by 24% and basal cover by 30%. There was a 3.5 to 4.5 times greater probability of striking vegetation in 2015 than there was in 1978. Similarly, Petra's analysis of the repeat photos showed a significant increase in vegetation cover and a decrease in bare ground and rock cover. It's not just about cover either. You can see in the image on the left with Fred Kruger sitting in the foreground that the recent fire in the 1960s was cool and hardly touched the mature Protea lorifolia individuals in the background. Contrast this with the image on the right, which is the same post-fire age. The hot fire which burned through the site a few years before 2013 killed the mature Protea individuals and resulted in many hundreds of new seedlings. Vegetation cover is also significantly greater in 2013 than it was in 1970. Not all fynbos species, of course, benefit from these changes in biomass and in the fire regime. Joe White's study of 1,313 woodring Tonia cedarburgensis individuals in the Cedarburg, for example, show that this species has declined by 74% since 1931. Mortality appears linked to where the species grows, but also to increased fire frequency, although the model didn't explain much of the variance in the data. Any discussion of long-term change in fynbos vegetation wouldn't be complete without a mention of Hugh Taylor's Cape Point plots and the recent results which have emerged as a result of this resampling of 54 of his 10 by 5 meter permanent plots. Jasper Slingsby and colleagues showed that there was a significant decline in the number of species over time, which was driven by severe post-fire summer weather events. Respirators, graminoids, and herbaceous species seemed especially affected. This study is one of the most important early warnings of the potential impact that climate change could have on FYNBOS vegetation. After sampling each of these plots, Hugh also took a photograph of the plot layout. One of our MSc students, Robin Powell, revisited Hugh's sites and retook 85 of his photographs. While the photographs do not provide the same granular level of deep detail as the plot data, they're nonetheless really interesting. Not only do they show some of the really dramatic events that can happen at coastal sites such as Potbank, where there's been a complete dune blowout since Hugh's days, they also can show radical changes in vegetation communities, such as at Wildebeest, where a tall graminoid vegetation, restoid vegetation, was completely replaced by shrubland between 1966 and 2012. But for the most part, shrubland behaved as shrubland should. Restiofluctus retained their general physiognomy, and wetlands were still wetlands. They hadn't dried up or become arid wastelands over time. This last point is important because even though the photographs can't provide the level of detail that's available in permanently marked plots, they do provide a more general landscape level perspective and address questions of ecosystem function. As important as the fine plot detail is, it also needs to be scaled up to the landscape and to ecosystem level processes to really make wider sense as well. So that's what we think is going on in some mountain and plains FYNBOS locations. But what about the long-term dynamics in Strandveld vegetation? Two quick photo pairs give you some idea. The first is from the Cape Flats Nature Reserve, adjacent to the University of the Western Cape campus in Bellville. The first photograph was taken by Barry Lowe in 1983, while the second photograph forms part of Kim Daniels' honours project and was taken in 2020. The annuals have been removed, but there's been a significant increase in woody plant cover over the 37 years, and this pattern is generalized for the reserve. The second pair is of the coastal plain around Seal Point Lighthouse, just a few hundred meters from Richard Carling's house in Cape St. Francis. The view was reasonably open just 20 years ago, with a few large gasterias showing off their flowers. Since then, the expansion of low-growing thicket species, such as this prostrate form of milkwood, have taken over much of this landscape and now throttle the gasterias as they struggle for light. So it's a war out there, folks. So that's probably enough about FYNBOS, and let me shift now to the Nama-Karoo biome. The early story here was dominated by John Acox's views of an eastward expanding Karoo, which was largely to Victoria and engulfing the Free State grasslands along the way. John argued this was because of overgrazing. Climate change projections suggest a similar contraction of grasslands, but this time it's because of climate change and the general aridification of the region. And one of my earliest contributions challenged this view, and together with Richard Carling, we argued that the opposite was in fact occurring. I've since had the good fortune of working with colleagues like Morto Masupilele and James Gambiza and William Bond on the problem. And Morta's PhD and subsequent publications confirmed this initial view. A general summary of change in the Nama-Karoo is shown in the figure in the bottom right here, and shows the majority of matched photos either show little change in vegetation cover or an increase, especially in the cover of grasses. This story seems to be the gift that just keeps on giving, and recent work by PhD student Gina Arena has both broadened and deepened our understanding of what's going on in the region. Gina analyzed the data from 18 climate stations, and she resurveyed 27 of Piet Roos' original transects in the Eastern Karoo. She also rephotographed more than 100 sites and looked at historical stocking rates data to document these changes. Her results suggest that this trend of increasing grass cover has, if anything, intensified over time, both in the Nama-Karoo on the left, as well as in the grassland biome. And it's not just poor quality grass species that have increased in cover at sites that were previously dominated by Karoo shrubs. Gina's shown, using a standard rangeland ecology approach, that the carrying capacity has increased nearly fivefold in the Karoo and has more than doubled in the grasslands. Gina's analysis of rainfall from 18 locations spread out across the Eastern Karoo shows the last 50 years have been relatively wet compared to the very dry period from 1900 to the mid-1970s, when the reports of the Drought Investigation Commission, the Desert Encroachment Committee, and of course John Acock's own expanding Karoo ideas were produced. And also when Dr. Roo collected his data for his PhD thesis on tetrachnidragia. This trend of increasing rainfall is supported by a comprehensive analysis of the Middelburg rainfall record by Justin du Toit and Tim O'Connor, as well as a more recent analysis of sites to the west of Middelburg by Christian Harmse and colleagues in the Upper Karoo, which all these studies show an increase in rainfall in the Nama-Karoo over the second half of the 20th century. Another potential explanation for this increase in grass cover in the Eastern Karoo is the decline in livestock numbers, especially sheep, since their peak in the 1930s. Gina's analysis of the agricultural census data shows a 67% decline in sheep numbers, driven in part by state-sponsored interventions and other factors, perhaps also drought. Goat numbers have also declined by nearly 90% over the last 100 years. This is not to say that all is necessarily well with the Nama-Karoo biome. It's a very large biome covering a third of the country. In the more arid reaches along the Orange River, for example, Kirsty Ngedenwa's PhD research on Pachypodium namaquanum, Hoffman's, suggests that some populations have declined precipitously over the last 100 years. Theft on a grand scale is almost certainly involved, but so too is climate. Conditions for the recruitment of this species have changed, and the spectacular images showing Hoffman's leaning northwards might be a thing of the past. Finally, what about the savanna grassland and Indian Ocean coastal belt biomes? We've got about more than 300 repeats of these major eastern biomes, most of which were taken by James Puttick. While a full analysis of the images is yet to be completed, they provide a very useful visual representation of the changes, at least, that have occurred sometimes over quite short time frames of only a few decades. Here, for example, is a set of photographs from the Wiener Nature Reserve showing the extent of woody plant thickening between 1955 and 2011 in the foreground slope in the distant valley. Or this site at Driehoek Valley in KZN, which shows the expansion of gallery forest out from the main drainage lines below the escarpment, as well as the increase in savanna species on the ridge themselves. Woody species don't seem to have breached the escarpment itself, although this raises all sorts of questions and hypotheses. One of the most consistent patterns in the eastern part of the country is the abandonment of agricultural fields in the communal lands. Almost without exception, these old lands have become inundated with woody plants, such as at the site in the Eastern Cape. Finally, it's not just the Emesic eastern areas where woody plants have thickened up. the arid savannas in South Africa and Namibia. I've also seen a marked increase in trees, such as at the site at Magisterial, south of Kimberley. Had the Boer War been fought 100 years later, far fewer young Boer British and Canadian soldiers would have died, as there would have been better cover for them to hide behind. An analysis of the extent of woody cover encroachment using repeat photos has been superseded by the excellent syntheses undertaken by colleagues such as Andrew Scarno and Nikki Stevens, who've mapped bush encroachment using satellite imagery and aerial photography. The change is widespread across the region, but especially in Limpopo, and started long before Southern Africans were talking about climate change. In a few localities where mega-herbivores are present, rates of decline, but elsewhere, rates of change can be extremely rapid. Repeat photos can be very helpful in visualizing these changes, not only in terms of the extent of change, but also in terms of the species involved. Sometimes you also get to be part of a really fun project where your students have photographs of themselves as young people, and then return to the same site to study bush encroachment, and can't believe how much they and the felt has changed in the meantime. Repeat photos have also been used successfully in the savannas and grasslands to document long-term changes in cycads. Here, Desala Akuba Michael, a postdoc, measured the fate of 626 individual cycads in 73 repeat photos and showed how 78% had survived to the mid-1990s, but by 2014, only 16% of the original number remained. Theft of individuals on privately owned land was the greatest reason for the decline. Nikki Stevens helped us create this summary map for what we think our repeat photos are telling us about vegetation change in South Africa. The map formed part of a general synthesis report called Change is in the Air, which was led by Nikki and other colleagues such as William Bond and Guy Midgley, who are active in the field of climate change. There's a nice video of this story as well for those interested. So in the final slide, I'd like to suggest 4 reasons why the past trajectories don't always align well with future projections. The first is that modeling the future is an extremely complicated process, and it's difficult to include the many complex processes that influence vegetation change. Historical observations provide an integration of these influences. A second reason is that we are still in the very early stages of the changes that are yet to come. If the impact of the recent drought in the low-lying areas of Namaqualand and the Ruchtersveld is anything to go on, we might soon exceed the physiological thresholds of many species. The responses might also not be immediate, and time lags in species responses to climate change might obscure its impact. Also, long-term data are rather patchy, and it's often difficult from only 2 time steps to get a good idea of the real trajectory of change. Finally, it's also worth considering that a historical view might not be all that helpful, as in some cases, future climate might be like nothing we have ever experienced in the past. That's a thought worth keeping in mind as well. So I'm most grateful to the many students and research assistants, past and present, who worked on the collection of historical photographs, which are currently housed in the Plant Conservation Unit. Thank you very much for all your hard work and dedication. And thank you to all of you for listening to this talk.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. That was an amazing presentation. Wow. What a tour through our country and over many, many generations and decades. Amazing. Thank you. So as I said, we'll take questions. So there's lots of commendations and praise in the chat there coming up. So has anyone got a burning question to start us off with? Or can I ask one first? So it seems, Tim, that we're getting an increase in vegetation in many of those biomes that you showed us. But we're losing some of the really interesting diversity there, and that seems to be shown by the species that we would notice the most. Is that an accurate reflection of what you've shown here, or is it really biome specific?
Yeah, I've been, how's that? Can you hear me, Glynis? Is that okay?
Perfectly, yes, perfectly, thank you.
Yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about that. And it seems that, you know, at the one hand, you can have some species like Pachypodium namaquanum, the Hoffmans, clearly in free fall. It's dying in large numbers. Not sure exactly why. Maybe it's climate change, maybe certainly theft is involved. But on the other hand, you can have just down below in the plains, you can have an increase in some of the more dominant shrubs, ragosums, maybe the lycium, some of the, you know, some of the more woody elements along the riverine patches. So you can have both things happening at the same time. And I think the photographs are quite useful in many cases, because especially for these tall emergent species in the desert biome, you can count them, you can measure them, you can even measure growth rates like in the Aloe-Pilanzi, and you can create a population model based on the increment in height every year. And then you can extrapolate back in time and work out that you have very discrete recruitment events happening over time. So the pictures are very powerful. You also miss a tremendous amount with the photographs. For example, you don't get the little succulents, you don't get the conophytums, you don't get all those small mesems that are so critical to the biodiversity of the succulent Karoo. And it seems from Nick and Uta's work that they've really been heavily impacted. And Peter also has been describing the impacts anecdotally of the recent drought on some of these smaller mesem populations. So yeah, trying to understand all of it at once is quite difficult, but you can have these different things going on at the same time, I think, and it's quite difficult to get your head around that.
Right, yeah, thank you. Okay, so there are some questions here. So Guy Midgley has a question. Guy, if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead there, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hi, Tim.
Oh, long time no see, Guy. Nice to see you. Be gentle. My mom's in the room, eh? Remember that.
Oh, God. No, I thought, you know, I think this is, I mean, as we discussed when you started doing these match photographs, this is such an incredibly valuable resource. And it highlights a lot of the subtleties of what's going on, the complexities in ecology, the difficulties of capturing those processes in models. But I wanted to, you know, I wanted to sort of point out that the early impact modeling that was done in the early 2000s was driven by climate scenarios that were developed in the 90s, which all predicted a very significant drop in rainfall over quite a short term. And, you know, your own analysis show that we haven't seen that drop in rainfall. And so in a way, there was no way those models could have been right, certainly by now, because you've had a little bit of warming, certainly you've had some warming, but you haven't had that catastrophic drop in rainfall. So in a way, you know, it's a bit like shooting at fish in a barrel if you take aim at those early projections, but certainly the more recent ones after 2010, where we really start, where, you know, effects of CO2 are start to be included, and even the bioclimatic models suggest in 2013, 2014, rather mild changes under low climate impact scenarios, even up to, you know, 2040, 2050. But what I find extremely interesting is this, you know, the increase in cover in a lot of settings, which really seems to point to a strong, obviously the land use impacts and the release from land use pressure is an element. But CO2 is increased by almost 40% since the 1800s. That's a massive increase in a resource that plants use for their growth, and it increases their water use efficiency. It's a bit like adding rain, adding CO2. And with a little bit of warming, some of these cooler biomes like the succulent Karoo, you might expect positive responses which are going to enhance that recovery from overutilization of felt. So I think those are really, really interesting. It's a really good news story for at least short-term resilience. But as you say, some of the responses of smaller populations in the succulent Karoo to this recent drought are very worrying and would more closely reflect some of the earlier projections. But difficult to tease apart, but I think the photographs are a phenomenal resource. And how much more are you going to be doing on the photographs, and are you going to be expanding to different areas which provide further tests of some of the critical changes? Long question, sorry.
Guy, thanks so much. And that's exactly the kind of comment that I value, and I hope others in the chat room would make the same kind of contributions. I've looked through the names, and there are many individuals who are, real experts in their field. So please feel free to, elaborate and, and give exactly the kind of response that Guy's just done. So to sort of come to some of your issues, yes, I agree. We did set up like a bit of a straw man with those early projections. I mean, they were quite a gift for us because they gave us something to work with. Whenever I see, for example, John Acox's map of the expanding Karoo and your own early work, which had these amazing maps. I mean, it's very courageous to draw a map of South Africa and to say, this is where I think things are, this is how it's going to change. Because it's a real hypothesis that gives others, something to work with. And it's extremely valuable to kind of direct our questions, direct our sampling, look for the images, sharpen our questions, and so on. So it's been extremely valuable. I think we need more. We need, more models, more of that sort of thing. It's gone quite quiet in the last 5 years. I know you've been busy in other directions, and it would be really nice if you could help us think through how we could use these pictures to pursue even, the kind of questions that you might be interested in. How many more I'm going to do? Well, what am I, 60? I think I'm 63 this year, so I don't know. It's got to stop sometime. But I enjoy doing it. So, but you're right. We need maybe some new questions, new directions. And I'm also very concerned at the moment about kind of archiving these collections as well. They need to have a home. I'm very concerned about that. So that's a bit of a side issue. But thanks again, Guy, and lovely to see you again.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Guy. So there's a question from Karen Esler. Karen, do you want to speak out your question?
Hi, Tim. I'll also put my video on if you can see me. I'm not sure you can.
It's lovely to see you.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, a lot of what you were saying, you're a sort of aligning a sort of range of different types of evidence in order to draw some conclusions out of the data that you're collecting. And to me, that's quite an interesting indicator of the kind of way in which we're sort of moving. It's quite interdisciplinary in its approach. And so my question was really around, if you were to set the research agenda for this kind of work going forward, what would you do? What would you include, and how would you train our students as well?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I'm still keen to come and get your old slides that you have of the Karoo and everywhere else. So I thought I'd just slip that in there.
Yes.
Look, it sort of touches on this idea of interdisciplinarity. It's quite tricky because, you know, this, I think there's still quite a big divide between the sort of social sciences and natural sciences. And I know you, more than anybody else, is working across this divide. But it is tricky because each one of those disciplines is moving at such breakneck speed on its own. For example, the demands on our students to be numerate, quantitative, statistical is huge. And it's very hard to invest heavily in that. And then it's at the same time learn all of the tools and techniques that are required within the social sciences. And it's very difficult to take courses across these disciplines. And so what one has to do invariably is work with colleagues and friends. Like my friendship with Rick Rody has just taught me so much and has been so instrumental in my own sort of growth and development and learning about landscapes and the impact that people have on the environment. So I'm not answering your question, but you know, and you probably have a better answer than I do. But certainly it would be to work across the disciplines and have real respect for the kind of work that's done by other disciplines. You know, it's often very rigorous. It's often quite theoretical, and you know, to learn from colleagues in the social sciences and you know, anthropology and other areas has been one of the most important and enjoyable aspects of my own career path. You know, when you teach, I try and teach some of this in my third year courses, maybe at honors level. I would run a field course, for example, 5 days at the honors level. I've done that a few times, visiting communal areas, going to stock posts, walking with herders in the rural areas, watching goats, spending a few evenings in the communal areas, going to archaeological dig sites, looking at paintings, reading the literature, going to the fossil park at Langebaan, looking at how paleoecologists interpret the environment, exposing our students to multiple different ways of looking at the past. I'm lucky to have Lindsay in our group. Lindsay has all the paleo skills, so she brings that sort of expertise and that sort of the details of that discipline to our groups as well. So, you know, it's a bit of a sort of a hodgepodge of things, but just exposing our students to all these different ways of thinking, I think is how I've gone about it anyway. Yeah. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. So there was also a question here from Chelsea Kaler. Chelsea, are you there? Would you like to ask it, or shall I read it out? Okay, so Chelsea wants to know are there any interesting finds or observations for alien species?
Yeah, I've had conversations with Dave Richardson about that as well. There are far fewer than what I would like. I have one fantastic image taken by Mishak Bosov near Hermanus, which shows this amazing diverse FYNBOS landscape in the 1980s. And then the next image, if you fade it in, is just a wall of acacia, either longifolia or saligna, I can't remember which. But they're far fewer than what you'd think. And those that we do have, say on the Cape Peninsula, of say pines in Silvermine, one of our citizen scientists, John Watermeyer, shows a very nice repeat where all those pines are now gone because of the Working for Water programs. I have a few in the sort of Brandvlei, Kennard area, and Wakesvlei of expanding Prosopis in the riverine areas, but it's surprisingly few. Of course, there's all the Apuntias from the Eastern Cape, the prickly pears. They some of the classic repeats showing these dense stands around Spandau Kop near Graafrenet, and then the next image after they brought in the insects to eat the blades, you suddenly see all those prickly pears gone. So those are some of the early classics. But probably if we look hard enough, we'd see that along the KwaZulu-Natal coastline, the former Transkei coastline, bugweed and so on, we probably should see quite a lot of them. But I haven't pursued that myself, but it's probably worthwhile keeping that in mind. I'm always looking for more pictures. I'm always looking to build our collection. And they don't have to be photographs from 1900 or 1930. Even pictures from 2000, pictures from 1990, even pictures from 5 years ago can be used to good effect to quantify, to measure, to document the impact that's happening at a landscape level to our vegetation. They're very powerful, and I think we can do better at quantifying these changes, but they can be very useful to getting the message across.
And do you want people to email you those images or put them up on the that citizen website that you mentioned?
Yeah, okay. Now I've created something maybe. Yeah, I think we're quite selective, but I would, yeah. So it would be nice if they emailed me first of all and said, look, I have this collection. What do you think? Does it make sense? Would you be interested? As I say, we've got about 80 photographers collections we have. We've sort of had a cutoff at about 2000, the year 2000. We don't take much after that for our historical collection. But if people are interested to set up their own ongoing sort of photographic monitoring programs, I've done quite a bit of that in, for example, Rimfasmark in the Northern Cape, and I'd be more than happy to share some of those ideas, what's worked, what hasn't worked, the limitations, and what you really need to do in order to make a photo monitoring program really work. I'd be very happy to be part of a discussion around that as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Okay, questions. Eugene, you have one. Tim, have you discussed the recruitment of large succulents with Ernst van Jaarsveld?
Yes, I went to Ernst, and Ernst has got his own, when he was still at Kirstenbosch, he's got his own, wonderful collection in filing cabinets of slides, and I've scanned some of them. And we have discussed, perhaps not in enough detail, I have used one or two of Ernst's photographs from Cornell's Corp, actually, of Aloidendron pilanzi now it's called. So we have had some discussion. Yeah, that work's kind of stalled a little bit. We need to get onto the modeling and get much more quantitative, get the measurements of growth rates. And I've got a few ideas for this year to involve someone who's far more numerate than me to do this work. But yes, another meeting with Ernst. I see the most recent Felton Flora has got a special on Babylon's touring, so I think I need to go out there and meet up with Ernst and have more discussions with him. I look forward to that. Thanks, Eugene.
Good. And then Alistair Potts, some of your questions have been answered. Do you want to come live and ask Tim?
Well, no, I think Tim's already covered most of them in terms of the span. I suppose the one question would be is, Tim, you've been looking backwards very kind of haphazardly. Whatever's available. Just it's been haphazard. But if you were to, is there a way of looking forward of using this same technique? It's a very, very powerful technique. It doesn't need a lot of training. You don't have to be, you don't need years and years of botanical training to go and identify all the plants in a quadrat. So, what about being strategic and placing repeat photos stations across a landscape and starting that as a baseline? Have you thought about that? Are you doing that? Is someone doing that?
Yeah, I think for a young, talented person like yourself, that's an amazing project. And I encourage you to set it up. I think it's exactly what needs to happen. I know that there's this kind of work going on in many of the national parks in the United States, for example. They have these set stations, often with even a pole and a place to rest your camera or rest your phone and some instructions. And then as people are hiking through the mountains, they can just pop their cell phone on there, take a picture and upload it to a site. and it's even automated. The matching is automated, and it sort of forms part of a citizen science monitoring program. Yeah, that I think is ideal. I think that'll be fantastic if some of our people in the national parks, Cape Nature and other parks were to think about this. It requires a little bit of technical know-how, and it requires somebody who's dedicated, who's there, who's able to persist, who has a real interest in this and maintain the data sets, maintain the websites, keep, that's the difficult part, is sort of keeping it alive over not just a few years, but over decades. That's where the real value comes in.
But given the immense value that you've shown out of your photos, it seems that it would be a relatively cheap way of monitoring. Having a dedicated group that set up a monitoring thing like this. And then the other thing is that I was just concerned about if you leave it to Cape Nature, or if you leave it to specific reserves, then we're only monitoring reserves. We're not monitoring across landscapes. We're again doing it a little bit haphazardly, whereas maybe there's an opportunity to kind of think about, here's a strategic plan of monitoring vegetation going forward. And I suppose this being SAAB, and this is a way to get potentially get public interest, citizen science, to get people to look at plants and look at the landscape with further detail. So maybe there's an opportunity and a challenge for all of us to consider.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I've also, on that point, Alistair, I've had, thanks for all of this. I've had colleagues from other institutions over the last several decades say to me they want to set up a monitoring system across South Africa. So I've suggested to them, well, why not start with what we already have? Why want to have something going from brand new again? Why not, we have nearly 2,000 sites now, spread out. Okay, it's not great coverage across the whole country, but some of them are easily accessible sites. And if it was housed within the appropriate institution, maybe 100 of them could form, you already have maybe 50 or 60 years of information, and maybe set up some of those that we already have, maybe even coupled with some of John Aycox's locations. But it requires some kind of institutional buy-in, some kind of institutional responsibility. And that's one of my most important tasks in the next few years, is to try and find a home for this for this collection, so that it doesn't just end up in my office at home when I retire, and then eventually just go to the infamous file 13. Yeah, it's got to have a home, and I've got to find that home.
Thanks, Tim. Fantastic talk.
Thank you, Alistair. Nice to see you. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump to Guy Midgley's comment here and question: Is Tim working with SAAB? They have selected new landscape sites for their FTON work.
Yeah, look, our friends and colleagues are I have friends and colleagues in SAAB, and I'm aware of the FTON sites, and yeah, I'd love to do more work with them. I am also in a discussion with Claire Davis, who I believe is managing the data management node she's very involved in that node for SAAB, and I need to follow up and pursue that, with more vigor. Too much to do, unfortunately.
Need another lifetime. Okay, Uta, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for the very, very nice and rich talk. I was wondering whether you have any sign or any data whether the more arid parts of the succulent Karoo, Richtersveld and Knaasvlek, for instance, where the plants are closer to maybe a threshold of what they can cope with regard to climate severity. Do you think that they would show a different pattern over time, or do you have any indication for that?
Okay, so this is where I'm being asked the question by the world expert, the leading expert in the succulent flora of the Richtersveld. and the succulent Karoo. To answer that, I'm only aware of Norbert's work that he published in the 1999, I think it was called Plant Ecology, the special issue that Richard Cowling and Karen Essler and Phil Rundell edited. And Norbert's work suggested that that 1979 drought had a tremendous impact on, or I think many of the succulents disappeared there as well. And it seems they had a particular response the kind of species that were growing there seemed to be able to completely disappear for a few years in heavy drought, and then slowly over the next 20 or 30 years, they started to come back again. And I think this has happened again in the Richtersveld. So I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but I would suggest that probably you have a really good answer to that question as well. We have spoken about, say, the Kamiesberg higher altitude areas not being as affected. The areas that I know best, say in Paulshoek and so on, they haven't been as affected by this mega drought that we've just had, whereas your work in the Knasvlakte and Subatsfontein, and I think Norbert's work also has shown a real big collapse of many of the succulents in the low-lying areas and in the Richtersveld. Yeah.
Yes, maybe what we can show is with our annual data, we can show how the plants respond to the recent drought. And what you can show is what might have happened over the last 50 years or so. So I'm not quite sure whether you have any data, any photos from these dwarf succulent communities from 50 years back or so, to show, okay, there is a recovery and little change over long term or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's also one of the limitations of these repeat landscape photographs, is that they often are taken of views of landscapes, and often they're not obviously turned down where you can actually count individuals of these small minute mesems, these small succulents. So you can get pictures, say, of Alopilanzi or Aloramicissima, Alodichotoma, and so on, and some of the other taller shrubs and trees. But to get this kind of population dynamics of these small little succulents is a lot more difficult. And the repeat ground photographs just don't really get you that. Not that I'm aware of yet. And I think the kind of work that you've been doing, monitoring year after year for what, 20 odd years now, very detailed sampling at a plot level is really, sort of going to give us the information long term. We know that this current drought has really impacted heavily on populations of Alopilanzi in the south of Cornelskop. Elseby Swart's work has shown, quite a big impact of this drought on Alopilanzi, but that's not the same as these small succulent populations.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that question, Uta. Then Ben Cousins, are you here? Would you like to ask your question?
Oh. Tim, the paper is called Rethinking Catastrophe. Not one single question has responded to your provocation. Is climate change that catastrophic, or what does this mean for us thinking about the future? So I want to invite you to present some kind of answer to that big question, that what is going on here? And particularly for those of us who are not natural scientists, how should we understand this? What is the message coming to us? And so let me leave it at that. Thanks.
So Ben's one of my oldest and dearest friends, and I would expect nothing less than such a tough question. And in fact, Ben was one of the first people to introduce me to the Namaqualand area. So I've learned a tremendous amount from Ben, and he's constantly asking me questions like this, for which I have very little answer. So I perhaps thinking on my feet, I would suggest cautiously, it's clear from the measurements that temperatures certainly have increased. I think that's incontrovertible. I think I think across the country we've seen these increases in temperature. Rainfall seems a little bit more variable. We've seen the last 5 or 6 years across the winter rainfall region, the first real indication that perhaps, these are the kind of predictions that the climate change models are suggesting. And if we get in the next 20 years, the frequency of these, then we really, are onto something pretty big. Quite what the impacts of these changes in the climate variables are on the vegetation is a bit more difficult to discern, because we have, on the one hand, we have the big impact of land use that was apparent in the first part of the 20th century across across nearly all of Southern Africa. I know the Karoo best, and people were really using the Karoo. They had millions and millions of animals. They had small farms, they had very high stocking rates, they had donkeys, they had goats, they were cultivating, they were using fuel wood, and they were burning in FYNBOS. And now to disaggregate, to take, suddenly you don't have that anymore. In the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've seen that heavy land use impact has stopped. And so you have both the kind of recovery of the vegetation as a result of the sort of lessening of this very intense land use happening. And then on top of that, you also have these increased temperatures, maybe even increased drought frequencies and so on. So to really work out what's happening is very tricky. My suggestion, prior to say the last 5 years, my answer would have been there's very little impact at this point. There's very little evidence at this point that these high temperatures are having any real effect. Certainly in the western part of the country, in the Karoo and in FYNBOS. CO2 and so on in the eastern part of the country, I think, has led to a significant increase in bush encroachment, although it's been a problem there for more than 50 years. I have this book here, the 1957 Handbook of Farmers in South Africa. And one of the chapters is the bush encroachment problem, where they say more than 50% of the old Transvaal sweetveld has been encroached, and they list the same sort of species that we see listed today. So that's been a problem for a very long time as well. So I think up to about 5 years ago, I would have been very cagey, and I would have said, look, there's very little evidence at this point that the kind of changes we've seen in climate have really had a big impact on the vegetation of South Africa. Now I'm a little bit more cautious. I think this big drought we've had has been quite a shock. And now I think, it pays to be a little bit more careful about writing articles like Rethinking Catastrophe. Question mark. Don't forget the question mark.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben. I don't know if I answered your question, but others might feel much more strongly about climate change. Others who work in the field and write about it. I mean, there are people in the chat room who are sort of, like Guy and so on, who are real international leaders in the field, and others, many others in the chat room who really, maybe they want to say something.
Yeah, Guy does want to say something. Guy, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. There's no law of nature that says that climate has to change in a gradual and linear way. In fact, a lot of the history tells us that when climate changes, it can often, you can often get a regime shift. And, we saw in Western Australia, this sudden drop in winter rainfall some 15 years ago in 2 phases. And they've been struggling a lot, wildfires and all sorts of other problems. And then but on the other side, we've got the CO2 increase, which Tim started 180 years ago. So 50 years ago, CO2 had already risen some 20% above the pre-industrial era. That's already quite a big kick for plant growth. If you look at the way plants respond to CO2, their initial response is quite high, and then they saturate. It increases their water use efficiency. So as I said, it's like adding rainfall. And I think this is, this part of the world is one of the best places to test this, because we're such a water limited part of the world. So we don't have any field CO2 experiments. We've done some in the greenhouse, but the observations on the land surface and these MASH photographs, I think, are incredibly valuable data to start really testing that CO2 impact. We know that the oceans and the atmosphere have been taking up half of all human emissions for decades. 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels have gone back into the land and into the ocean by 25% each. So something's growing faster. And I think that's to respond to Ben Cousins. That's possibly a really good news story. But we got to get on top of how this all works. And you may find that climate's a real driver in the West, CO2 is the real driver in the East, in which case you're going to get this real aggravation of the gradient of vegetation cover from west to east. That's a possibility. What does that do to regional climate? We don't know. But yeah, we're learning and learning quite fast. But I would say that there is substantial risk out there, particularly in the West with these little succulents. I think they're very vulnerable, and we need to be quite cautious.
Good. Right. Well, thanks, Guy. And then Dave Richardson's been very patiently waiting. He's got a question. Dave, would you like to go ahead there? Dave? Okay, so Dave wanted to ask about riparian zones.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, I don't know quite what the details are. It probably has something to do with aliens, perhaps, but also they seem to be the areas where we've seen the greatest change the quickest. They seem to be a very good sort of place to put the thermometer of vegetation change, right across from perennial rivers, river banks along the Orange River, for example. Tremendous increase in, for example, Phragmites because of increased sediment. In mud layers, tremendous increase in Phragmites. Prosopis along the Orange is really taken over there. Has been for decades now. But even in the more drier areas, I think Dave's led some of the work on Prosopis in the Northern Cape. They've also especially along the riverine areas, not only, but especially there. And if we want to get a sense of which direction things are going, and often it's at the river systems that we can really pick up these changes. Even in the east, that one picture showing that gallery forest, and then the forest expanding, on the edges. Wherever there's water, things seem to really do much better. I don't know if that sort of touches on something of what Dave was suggesting, but
probably, I'm sure.
But we probably, you can get some measure of the species from the photographs, but you have to do the sampling, and it's not always easy to see in the original picture. If it's early enough, then it might be the case that you didn't have many aliens, but you can't always get down to species level, often just growth forms, and that's one of the limitations, especially in the eastern parts where you have much more dense cover. In the west, in the deserts and the Karoo and so on, it's much easier to pick out individual species.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's also, is it climate change, or is it just that there are now more aliens and they've taken hold, and it would have happened regardless,
Yeah, look, we're quite careful to, when we do our walking into the image and our sampling, we're quite careful to differentiate between what's alien and what's indigenous, and which direction each of these are going in, so that we can say something about the incidents. And we take pictures on site as well, on the ground, in the landform, and we archive those as well. We always keep it in our minds that maybe in a few decades to come, there'll be others who have an interest in going back to these locations and being more thorough than what we've been, and having then this archive of local sort of much closer views of individual landforms, and then can really quantify the extent of change that's happening as well. So we always have this in mind when we're sampling these different sites.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So there's one last question. I think let's take this question from Hannah Peterson. Hannah, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. Awesome talk, Tim. Thank you. Yeah, so my question was, it's really just in the chat, regarding policy. Do you think there's a space for repeat photography to actually form part of conservation policy? Maybe I'm just ignorant of it maybe being used in NDAs or things like that, but you know, the point of doing all of this research is sort of in the hopes that it will actually be applied. So I'm just wondering if you think that there's room for repeat photography to have a more applied impact on conservation. Thanks.
Gee, all those who I know best are asking me the toughest questions. So Hannah manages the Rephoto SA project and has been instrumental in pushing this method, and did an honors project on repeat photos in the Nama-Karoo, and could probably answer that question herself. Also, Sontom Tola and Sally Michelle have also been very involved in helping me with this talk. So thanks to everybody, and thanks to you, Hannah. Whether repeat photos could be involved in policy, I think we have to be, you know, they often, when I see the repeat photos used, they're often used as sort of as an add-on. They are, you know, often you'll see somebody give a talk and they'll talk about, say, bush encroachment, and then start by showing maybe 3 or 4 nice repeats from Rephoto or some of their own repeats, and they'll say, well, it's a problem, and then they'll move on. So I think we have to, you know, be more quantitative, publish more, to be taken. I think we are taken seriously, but I think even more seriously. I think their real value comes in, for example, the individual species studies on, like Joe White's work on Woodringtonia, the Clan William cedar, Sam's work on Allodichotoma, DeSala's work, DeSala Kubo-Michael's work on cycads especially. I mean, you know, we've lost, what were the figures? Something like 78% have been lost of the cycads have been lost between the mid-1990s and the present. And most of that is to do with theft. Okay, I know there are good policies in place, environmental policies, but it's a real big wake-up call that people are really stealing our plants. And if we had the kind of evidence that Uta is suggesting might be possible, showing how our succulents in the succulent Karoo are being stolen, just left, right, and center, you know, as well as our fauna, of course, being stolen and sold to syndicates and so on. So I think these kind of examples, you know, the aloes, the cedars, the cycads, and pachypodiums and so on, I think they become important because they help to redefine the IUCN threatened species status. Attila Raimondo and Wendy Foden and others are going to be meeting soon to talk about Allodichotoma and its status, you know, where that needs to be changed and maybe upgraded because it's more threatened than we think. And so the repeat photo work when it comes to these individual species, I think can be extremely powerful because it gives this long-term perspective. And if you can get numbers out of it and you can use them, as I said earlier, to model, to document long-term change and just extend the reach a little bit more. So I think they do have, you know, great value. But I look forward to talking to you more about this tomorrow.
Okay. Great. Well, then I think we're going to call it a day. Tim, thank you so much. You've really done us proud. A great talk and some fantastic discussion. And once again, congratulations. Very well deserved. And thank you everybody for attending, for making this a special occasion. Thank you. And then just to say that these presentations will be put up on the actually on YouTube if the presenters are happy about that, but via a link on the SAAB website. So it will be a private site unless you wanted to go open access, but generally we will just put a link on the SAAB website so people can access them again if they'd like to. Right.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say thanks to you, Glynis, thanks to the SAAB committee, thanks again to Mathama. You know, I feel really honored to be a part of this group, and you know, really pleased. And thanks also to everybody for listening and for some really great questions and for the discussion. Yeah, it was really fun. I enjoyed myself, and look forward to seeing you all in person sometime.
Good. Okay. Yes, let's hope so. Thanks, everyone, and good night. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. I'm gonna just stop my video. Let's go start video.
Glynis, just stay on the line, please. We just need to download.
Yes, no, I won't go off. I was just switching my video off,
Okay.
but I'll stay on.
Stop recording. Sorry. Stop recording.